I want to emphasize that people can still grow muscle on a ketogenic diet. It just won't happen at an optimal rate and to a maximal degree. So, you'll get people who'll hear me say that and then go, I've been on keto for years. I'm jacked. Well, okay, cool. But if somebody came to me and said, hey, my main goal is to gain as much muscle as possible by, let's say, in 6 months or next year or whatever it is, then definitely ketogenic dieting is not going to be the optimal way to go about it.
Alan Aragon, number two, round two with you. I'm so happy to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back, Stephanie. It's a real privilege. How about privilege?
Yes,
An
it's a
honor to
privilege
be
for me
back.
too.
Thank you.
I recognize it is early in the morning your time, and I appreciate you appreciate you waking up to speak to me on the East Coast this morning. And last time you were on the show, I only got through, as I was saying, 2 questions of the several pages of notes. So I wanted you back on. And we only really talked about protein. We only really talked about the acute anabolic window, protein timing. We talked about minimum protein requirements, whether you're sedentary or you're an athlete. And there's 2 other macros that I wanted to potentially explore with you as well. I wanted to talk about carbohydrates, fat. I know that you've just published a meta-analysis on creatine, which I get asked about a lot. So we'll see how far we get. There might be a part 3. Yes. So let's start with carbohydrates. As I was saying to you in the pre-chat, a lot of women who listen to the show, I think have, and I did for years as well. So in all, transparent, I sort of came up through the keto world because I'm very interested in brain metabolism. I'm very interested in how the ketogenic diet can, alter things like mood, and it can be a really quick start for weight loss for many people. Mm-hmm. And so there was a long time where I too was afraid of carbohydrates. And I think that there's a lot of women that have, we'll say, a less than optimal relationship with it. So can we first start by talking about what the relationship is in terms of muscle growth and carbohydrates? So one of the things we talk about is carbohydrates, when we are ingesting them alongside protein, will help with reduce net muscle protein breakdown. And so if you're combining that with a protein source, let's say a whey protein after your workout or something, you have this MPS, and then you have this inhibition of muscle protein breakdown. So your net is hopefully your net is that you have more muscle growing or being created than you have breaking down. So if you are someone who is determined to economize your carbohydrate intake, what is the minimum amount of carbs that you would want to ingest in order to maximize muscle hypertrophy?
Okay, so we don't know that answer definitively. And that question hasn't been investigated systematically, where we do some sort of a dose response investigation to see where is that threshold where gains in muscular size start getting compromised. And so that research has never been done, but there has been quite a lot of research comparing flat out keto, which is, as you know, lower than 50 grams of carbs a day, versus a high carb model, which is typically, anywhere from 45, 50-ish% of the diet and up. And so observationally, there's a few publications that have speculated that the low end is about 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And we're talking about carbohydrate dosing that would still support muscle hypertrophy, or even possibly, maximize it. But that's the theoretical lower end, is 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is roughly about like 1.7-ish grams per pound of body weight. The reason why that is because there is a performance element that carbohydrate helps out with lifting capacity. And there's also a resting glycogen element that helps with just the volume that your muscle sits at. since for every gram of glycogen that we store in the muscle, there's 3 to 4 grams of water that are stored along with it. And so people who are chronically undercarbing are going to carry a significantly less glycogen at the muscular level. So there's
And run the
those
risk
two
of being
elements.
dehydrated as well. That's the other thing. They're also often
Mm-hmm.
dehydrated, which is why salt, like taking in salt, is very important for that population.
The
Yeah.
the main things, resting glycogen levels and performance are, and lifting performance are the main mechanisms that would separate a ketogenic model from a I guess a conventional or higher carb type of model. And we know that from a replication of studies showing exactly that lifting performance, lifting capacity is compromised as a result of ketogenic dieting. And I want to emphasize that people can still grow muscle on a ketogenic diet. It just won't happen at an optimal rate and to a maximal degree. So, you'll get people who'll hear me say that and then go, I've been on keto for years. I'm jacked. Well, okay, cool. But if somebody came to me and said, hey, my main goal is to gain as much muscle as possible by, let's say, in 6 months or next year or whatever it is, then definitely ketogenic dieting is not going to be the optimal way to go about it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because I've had there was a I'm thinking of one client in particular who was furious with me that I had suggested, I'd put together a meal plan and a fitness program for her because her main goal was putting on muscle. So we had it was about a 40-40-20. So it was about 40% of her total calories were coming from protein, about 40% of her total calories were coming from carbohydrates. And then it was sort of a moderate to low, say, fat, whatever the fill is there, 20% of the rest of her calories were coming from fat. And because she sort of knows that, I've talked a lot about the ketogenic diet for women. She was just furious with me and thought that, I was, pulling the wool over her eyes or something, it was some sort of scam or something like that. And I really want to work to dismantle some of the fear that I see a lot of women. I'm sure it's across the board, but I can draw on my own experience around fear around consuming carbohydrates for fear of weight gain. And part of it, what you just mentioned around the 3 to 4 molecules of water being stored alongside with glycogen in that sort of lattice, when it's stored in that lattice like structure is like easy come easy go, right? It's like you gain some water weight and it's like, and then you go and you have a really great lifting session, and then you're the water or the sweat or whatever, the glycogen utilization, you're going to be able to completely get rid of that. So I think that there's a big fear that I'm trying to dismantle. And so when we're talking about carbohydrate timing, let's say, what are your thoughts on, there's some people who front load, there's people who talk about, let's say, circadian rhythms and being more insulin sensitive in the morning. So honoring that, circadian rhythm and having most of your carbohydrates, let's say, front loaded to the front load of the day. There's back loading carbohydrates. There's sort of a even distribution of carbohydrates through the day. Where do you fall? Do you have a particular preference, or is there something that you've noticed that works better for if the goal, like if we're defining the goal as putting on as much muscle as we can, is it as important to distribute carbohydrates through the day as it is protein?
The short answer to that is no, it's not as important. But there's definitely some nuance to that to cover. And before I do that, I wanted to mention about carbohydrates and muscle hypertrophy, muscle mass.
Yes.
There is a really cool observational study by Andrew Chappell and colleagues. It's a 2018 study. And he basically examined the habits of the top 5 placing natural bodybuilders in the men's and the women's division at the elite level, so the national level, in natural bodybuilding competition. And their carbohydrate intake was relatively high. The people who placed in the top 5, so it was like 4 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. So it was at least about double your body weight in pounds when we're talking about grams of carbohydrate. and their fat intake was really low. It was like a third of a gram per pound. Um, and this is both the men and the women placing in the top five. And so there is definitely some wisdom to be gleaned from how the elite, with everything on the line, with top placings on the line, there's something to be learned from how they do it. And if ketogenic dieting was not a risk for coming in off or coming in flat or stringy or just not full and shrink wrapped and as lean and hard and full as possible, then we'd be seeing some ketogenic dieting in there with the elite. And we don't see it. So now there are some people who do a cyclical ketogenic dieting type of model, but when it comes down to it, the average about 2 grams of carbohydrate per pound of body weight during prep. And this is because they want to maximize the retention of muscle tissue while they're losing fat, and they've been on a calorie deficit for months. And so, yeah. Okay, so I wanted to get that statistic
Thank
out of the
you.
way first. So when people
Yeah,
think
great.
about the people show up as lean as possible, like as lean as you can get down to essential body fat levels right before death, even they're not ketoing. Okay, so and this is not to say that keto is a not a good tool, and this is not to say that keto doesn't work for a lot of people, because there's a lot of ways that keto does work. But when we're talking about maximizing muscle mass and retention, it's just not optimal for that.
Yeah.
So okay,
Which is why the
the
goal
next
is
question.
important. Yeah, why defining the goal is very important. So if it's just to shed water weight or to shed weight really quickly, the ketogenic diet does really well with that. But to your point, if the goal is muscle, putting on as much lean muscle mass as possible long term, and this is something I often say, like you can't stay in keto land forever. You can kind of get there, quick start, big dopaminergic rush, you feel motivated, you stick to it, and then we can move out of it, and then we can move into something that's a bit more balanced.
Right, right. So the next question that you asked me about carb positioning, or sort of the
Timing. Yeah.
timing of it, front loading, back loading, that sort of thing. And if we're talking about the context of muscle hypertrophy,
Yes.
it's got less importance than protein. But okay, so here's the thing about carb timing. There's some literature showing that lifting capacity is compromised when, let's say, you skip breakfast, versus having some sort of mixed macronutrient meal that happens to be high in carbohydrate. Lifting capacity is greater in that case. There's not a whole lot of literature on that, but anecdotally, you can talk to 10 trainees at a pretty high level, and you'll get all kinds of feedback regarding the amount of carbs they have or not prior to lifting. And so it's it is very rare for people whose main goal is to either get largely, like, hugely muscular. It's very rare for them to just be training stone cold fasted, lifting wise. And so, practically speaking, if you have some sort of mixed macronutrient meal with some level of carbohydrate in it within, I want to say, within 1 to 2 hours prior to lifting, then you would probably safeguard yourself from some of the performance compromises that a completely fasted lifter would feel in that respect. But at the same time, you don't need to just slam 100 grams of carbs immediately post workout. And we may have talked about this during the last episode about the whole anabolic window thing, where the paradigm is to slam quickly absorbed protein and carbohydrates as soon as possible after training, so you don't miss the window. So that model has pretty much been debunked by the fact that lifters are typically in a fed state for most of the day anyway. And so this distribution, this constant dosing of protein, carbohydrates, fats, throughout multiple meals in the day, it kind of negates the need to hyper focus on the immediate post exercise period. And the carbohydrate thing is interesting because we used to think that you needed to consume carbohydrate with protein post exercise in order to maximize muscle protein synthesis. But then several experiments were done showing that when you have enough protein, you don't need to add carbohydrate to it in order to maximize muscle protein synthesis. But then the question became, okay, well, what about net muscle protein balance? Don't we want to inhibit muscle protein breakdown maximally as well? And so the problem with that is it's tough to measure muscle protein breakdown. It's invasive and it's a pain in the butt. And so we just kind of default to measuring muscle protein synthesis because it's a lot easier to do. And there's this presumption that, especially in a protein fed state post exercise, that muscle protein synthesis it has like a 4 times higher magnitude than muscle protein breakdown anyway at in the fed state. And so it's sort of a relatively reliable proxy for net anabolism, not looking at muscle protein breakdown. But the question was still hanging. So in 2015, one of my friends, Juha Hulmi, Hulmi, he did the first, and to my knowledge, still the only study comparing a sizable dose of protein with protein co-ingested with a sizable amount of carbohydrate post-exercise in lifters, and running the experiment. And so this was in resistance trainees. I do believe that they were resistance trained as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Just define that for my
And
listeners. Just define what resistance trained means when we're talking about this in context of studies.
Yeah. So when we're looking at untrained subjects in a study, it's people who have no lifting experience, no formal exercise experience, especially in the context of muscle hypertrophy, no lifting experience. And they'll also allow people to be recruited if let's say they have not touched a weight in at least 6 months, so they're significantly detrained. And so but yeah, that's usually what defines an untrained subject, is no lifting experience within at least 6 months ish to a year. And then trained subjects, and by the way, these definitions are always arbitrary and they're always just kind of picked out of convenience. But in research, trained subjects means that they typically have had some resistance training experience, and they usually do the cutoff at about 6 months on the low end, all the way up to like 1 to 2 years. I've seen studies saying, okay, you have to have at least 1 to 2 years of lifting experience in order to participate in this study, because we're trying to track adaptations in individuals who are not just fresh off the couch. And usually it's better to use trained subjects instead of untrained subjects, because when you use untrained subjects, they'll get results on kind of anything you throw at them. They'll get the proverbial, in quotes, newbie gains. And when you're trying
With
to
a Z.
compare with of course of course with a Z.
Yeah.
And so they'll get those gains no matter what. And when you're trying to compare two different protocols, or you're trying to compare a experimental condition with a control condition, and you're trying to look at fine differences, they often get washed out when you use untrained subjects, because the newbie gains are so robust that they kind of mask any potential differences between the experimental agent and the control condition. So yeah, that's the whole trained versus untrained thing. And so yeah, what Juha Hulmi and colleagues found out was whether carbohydrate, and it was like a good amount of carbohydrate added to the protein dose was about 30 to 40 grams. So it was a big enough protein dose. And the maltodextrin dose was like 40 to 50-ish, I believe, that they added to that. So they compared protein by itself versus protein co-ingested with a sizable amount of highly glycemic carbohydrate post-exercise, just as that model would dictate. And they found no significant differences in muscle size and strength gains over a period of, I believe it was 10 to 12 weeks or so. What was the study? And that kind of closed the door on the concept that, okay, we need to position carbs with the protein post exercise to maybe not, maximize muscle protein synthesis, but at least hedge our bets towards minimizing muscle protein breakdown. And lo and behold, we didn't see anything exciting with doing that compared to not doing it.
And is that
Um,
because the MPS is so, you said, it's 4 times, we have sort of this 4x
mhm.
muscle protein versus the net muscle protein breakdown? Or is that because there's another mechanism like gluconeogenesis that might be happening with the 30 to 40 gram bolus of protein? Or do we know?
um, it, it, I would say that it's because we can max out net muscle protein gains with a high enough dose of protein. I think we can max out that difference between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown with protein alone when the dose is high enough. And so that dose would likely be that maximal dose. And I know that we talked about this last time. That maximal dose would be somewhere between zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which in imperial terms is right around 0.2 ish to 0.25 grams per pound of body weight. That would be the protein dose that appears to maximize the short term anabolic effect or maximize the muscle protein synthesis response, net muscle protein synthesis response. And so, yeah, there's protein kind of does the heavy lifting on its own as far as that short term MPS response goes. And if there's enough total calories in the diet, enough total carbs in the diet, and of course enough protein in the diet, then the shifting around and the positioning of carbohydrate is best left to pretty much individual preference as far as positioning it for maximizing muscle hypertrophy. And it doesn't have to be a very specific configuration of the carbohydrate timing in order to do that. And I want to throw in like a couple of caveats there. Like if somebody happens to train like twice a day, and but it is a little bit far fetched because somebody who trains twice a day doesn't necessarily have hypertrophy goals. But let's say they do train twice a day, and let's say they do end up tapping out glycogen or close to it in a given muscle group earlier in the day, and they're going to train again where they're basically recruiting those muscles again and within the same day, then it can help to make sure that you have a sizable amount of carbohydrate post exercise so you can expedite glycogen resynthesis and have them ready to go later on in the day. But that is kind of a far-fetched scenario.
Yeah,
Unless
that's not
you're looking at an endurance athlete, you know what I mean? But
right.
you know, we're talking about gains here.
Yeah, exactly. And so I wanted to bring up intermittent fasting because this is probably the most common question that I'm asked is, should I train fasted or should I train fed? And,
Mm-hmm.
my answer is often, you need to train when you can train. So like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's always going to be the best answer. I do
Mm-hmm.
both. So during the week, I have to wake up early, get to the gym early so that I can get my lift in and then be back home to, get my kids ready for school and all the things. But on the weekends, I have a lot more flexibility. So I have breakfast and I wait, an hour or whatever it is. And then we go to the gym. And then it's usually a higher volume workout because I have, a bit more time. But there, again, with this sort of, I wanted you to come back on because, your whole paradigm and body of work is around flexible dieting. But I think with flexible dieting comes flexible thinking as well. And I think it's really important to all the type A's that are listening because we tend to be all or nothing. It's like, well, if I can't do it faster, then just forget it. I'm just not going to do it. Or if I can't do it fed, then if I can't do it properly, I'm just not going to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
the way that I look at it is when you can get it in is when you should do it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it optimal to do it fasted? For me, probably not. I know that I probably would have a lot more muscle if I could eat, but I don't want to eat at 5 a.m. Like I don't want, I usually put some little, I put some, what do I put? I put EAAs and some collagen in my drink, even though I know collagen is not anabolic. I just put it in. So that's when I remember to take care of my skin.
Mm-hmm.
And then I eat when I can eat, right? So what are your thoughts on working out fasted versus fed? Are we missing, if someone's overly fasting, are there opportunity gaps there for, MPS and muscle remodeling?
Whenever I get asked the question, I'm thinking, okay, so what's the population and what's the goal and what's at stake here? What level are we talking about here? Are we talking about looking decent for, the family reunion, or are we talking about placing first at a national level competition? And so the
Right.
answers would kind of vary. But generally speaking, for a resistance training bout that is not endurance oriented, what I mean by that is something that doesn't approach or exceed 90 minutes and certainly encroach upon like the 2 hour mark, which some people's training is that way. Whether we're looking at just really kind of obsessively high level folks in a given sport that involves strength training and conditioning. So most people's resistance training bouts genuinely don't cross much over an hour. And so if that is indeed the case, then optimally you wouldn't go in there stone cold fast. And I mean, even you throw down some, some nitrogen matter there, some aminos.
Mm-hmm.
You're at least amino fed,
Yeah.
and the collagen is in there too, which is fine. It was cool. I mean, I take collagen myself. I think it's, I think there's enough evidence to point to the benefits of collagen supplementation. So it is a personal preference thing. It's almost like if you don't have time to have something pre-exercise and you're not willing to throw down a scoop or two of protein powder, which is what I would recommend, then okay, no big deal. Just make it up after the training bout. And there actually is research showing us a stronger anabolic signaling response, not necessarily muscle protein synthesis, but these anabolic signaling molecules activity is actually higher when someone is trained in a fasted state, because the body is kind of panicking for like a growth rebound afterwards. And so anabolic signaling is higher with that in response to that post-exercise meal after a fasted training bout compared to after a fed training bout. But then you strike a compromise there, because with a lot of folks, the amount of work output they can do, the amount of reps they can do for a given number of sets gets compromised when
Yes.
they are training overnight fasted versus training after a full-size meal after like 1 to 2 hours where they're just kind of set and kind of ready to perform. But yeah, if your training bout is not 90 minutes plus, you can still grow. You can still get away with fasted training if that's how your schedule works, and or if that's how you prefer it. And I do know a few people who train fasted whose goals are such that it's perfectly fine for them. They're not trying to win contests for muscular size. They're just trying to look a certain way and they've achieved that look. They're trying to perform a certain way and they've achieved that. And so therefore their personal preference really is what kind of guides their lifestyle and their quality of life, and they're doing just fine. So yeah, now if you ask me, hey, I want to do like the best possible training performance, and it's got endurance elements in there, and I train for 90 minutes real hard, and I want to be able to push through even the last, like I want the quality of training through the last half hour of my workout to be as as good or almost as good as the beginning part. Then I would be like, yeah, well, fasted training is not necessarily gonna be the ticket for that.
And for just so we're clear on fat loss, the ability when you're training fasted, there's no. My understanding is that there's no difference in terms of fat loss or oxidation, let's say, versus someone who is training fasted versus fed. So the way that I understand it is, yes, when you're fasted, you're drawing on there's more oxidation sort of during the activity. But then if you are following it with a meal, or someone who is training fasted, they will see that there's almost a phasic shift, let's say, in the beta oxidation, or the fat burning capacity of that individual, sort of that's moved later on in the day. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between fat, because women are like, I need to lose fat. Should I do my cardio or should I do my lifting session fasted? And you can redirect me here if I'm incorrect. But it seems like there's no net difference, let's say, over a 24-hour period of training fasted versus fed.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's really well put. And I'm going to try not to mess up how eloquently and simply you put that by by following up. But so my colleagues and I, we did a study in 2014ish, 2014. Sometimes it's all a blur. We did a study, and it wasn't a fasted lifting versus fed lifting studies. There's almost no studies like that. There's just like maybe one or two. And they do show that fed lifting does yield better performance. But we did a study on trainees who did fasted cardio versus fed cardio. So overnight fasted, and then you perform the cardio like moderate intensity, low to moderate intensity for about 50 minutes in the, in quotes, fat burning zone. And we compared that with doing cardio in a fed state, like right after the equivalent of a mixed macronutrient meal. And we ran the experiment for 4 weeks. And we measured body composition at the beginning and body composition at the end. And these were in non-lifting women. So untrained, college-aged women. And no significant differences. In everybody kept their muscle, amazingly. Well, that's because I set protein at 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And we didn't make the caloric deficit terribly aggressive, but everybody lost fat. Everybody kept muscle. No differences between the fed cardio group and the fasted cardio group. And to my knowledge, it's still the only study to date that's looked at controlled hypocaloric conditions, comparing fed cardio with fasted cardio. So we found that, well, after all, at least in that population, it doesn't matter. But then, like you mentioned, Stephanie, why would there be a difference if we're looking at the same amount of calories consumed at the end of 24 hours and the same macronutritional breakdown between the groups? Like, why would there be a net difference in fat balance? And so, but we just wanted to make sure, is there some magic to training fasted that might occur? And we were open to the idea because that was the legend and the lore of many generations back, like the magic of fasted cardio. We just wanted to test it out. But kind of like you mentioned, it's like when you train, whatever you're fueled on is pretty much what you're going to be burning. So whatever you ingest is what's going to fuel the activity. So let's imagine, somebody eats a high carb meal. They're going to be using those carbs during training. If somebody like ingests a stick of butter prior to training, they're going to be burning a lot of fat during their training. And right. So if somebody trains fasted, then they're going to be oxidizing more fatty acids than they would if they were, if they had some sort of meal. But that doesn't necessarily say much about 24-hour, the balance between fat oxidation versus fat storage in a 24-hour period. Because when you train fasted, yes, you do, in quotes, burn more fat during the training bout. But if you compare another person who trains in the fed state, but both people are eating the exact same thing by the end of the day, then the fasted training person is going to burn more fat during the training bout. The fed training person is going to burn more fat after the bout in the later part of the day, and it all comes out the same in the wash by 24 hours. And so the take home practical message from that is do what you personally feel best on, for what you personally prefer, because then you're more likely to execute. You're more likely to carry that habit out and get it done.
This is more of a philosophical comment, but I think that sometimes we just it's like this sort of type A need to this incessant need to perseverate on every single detail, and you need to do it 100% right or not at all. I think in most cases is a deterrent to actually just doing something, even if you're kind of doing it wrong or you're
Mm-hmm.
not doing it, quote unquote, optimally. I think it's just get out there. It's okay to suck, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to be a beginner and to learn. That's where all masters start. And I think that at least my observation in my own recovery from being a type A personality, there's this certain element of control, and that's why I think I field a lot of these questions, like which one's better? Should I train fasted or fed? Should I do cardio fasted or fed? When do I take my carbohydrates? First in the day, in the middle of the day, at the end of the, how much protein? And it's all this incessant sort of, it's like people are majoring in the minors, like just get to the gym, lift.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Mm-hmm.
probably going to not do it well, but just do something. And I promise you'll learn as you go. I'm still learning, and I've been
Yeah.
doing it for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great way to approach it, just mindset wise. And yeah, I agree with that.
All right, let's talk a little bit about creatine. You recently published a meta-analysis on the effect on muscle hypertrophy. I'd
Yeah.
love for you to describe, because I think some people were like, "Boo!" there wasn't like a
Yeah.
there wasn't like a big, like creatine is going to magically save us all from everything. But maybe you can describe the meta-analysis. And maybe we can talk a little bit about regional versus systemic muscle hypertrophy as
Hmm.
well, and then some of the other, I don't know, I don't want to call them off-label, but other benefits, let's say, that it might have that are not
Hmm.
just for body recomping and for strength.
Yeah, our meta-analysis on creatine, this is the one I did with Ryan Burke as the lead author, and we had a bunch of other good folks on there in the research community: Brad Schoenfeld, Darren Kandow, Max Coleman, et al. We did a meta-analysis, the first one to look at regional muscle hypertrophy, that's measurable by methods such as ultrasound and magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, looking at very muscle specific changes as a result of creatine supplementation. And usually, I mean, the vast majority of studies on measuring creatine's effects on body composition look at net or gross changes in just lean mass and fat mass. And so we were able to just look specifically at the muscle component of lean mass, because there's still the bone mass element to consider. There's intracellular water, extracellular water, and there's a bunch of other components. But we looked at muscle mass specifically, and the big disappointment was just such a tiny increase in muscle mass as a result of creatine supplementation. And I mean, the actual increases are really kind of
Was it
disappointing,
two?
really
Was it
sad.
2%? I think it was 2% from the study, maybe
Oh,
less.
that 2% would have been great.
Oh, it wasn't even two. Oh man.
I mean, So here's okay. So I'm gonna start with the disappointing stuff, and it is gonna end well. It will end well. So the disappointing thing is that the increases in muscle thickness on average were like a tenth. I hate to say it, but yeah, okay. So about a tenth of a centimeter beyond placebo. Okay, so it was already it was as high as 0.16 centimeters beyond placebo in terms of increases in muscle thickness as a result of supplementing with creatine. And you have to understand that when we report these values, we're talking about the average of the group. So in this case, in this case of a meta-analysis, we're looking at multiple studies. And so the average of all the studies. And so certainly there were some higher values and even some lower values. So we're reporting the mean increase.
And some of
And
these are
that's
going to be
pretty
untrained, trained,
minuscule.
like, yeah.
That's right. That's right. And that's a huge point that you bring up because in our meta-analysis, there were 10 studies that we drew data from, and only one of the 10 studies involved resistance trained subjects. There was another study that involved recreationally trained subjects, but I mean, their resistance training experience was minimal, like I believe, but far less than like it was to the order of weeks instead of months as far as resistance training experience. So really, in reality, we had 1 out of 10 studies involving resistance trained subjects. And so the hypothesis is that trained subjects could possibly get more benefit out of creatine use than untrained subjects. But regardless of whether you're trained or untrained, there are significant increases in strength and there are significant increases in lean body mass. And so body water would come up. Why exactly? We didn't detect much changes at the muscle level. That's a little bit of a mystery. I personally would chalk it up to maybe limitations of the instruments that we used or the fact that most of the subjects were untrained.
Hmm.
But on the bright side of creatine use, and this is a reason why I would still recommend creatine use, is that even in highly trained subjects, the strength increases in the creatine users are substantially greater than in the non-creatine users or the control group. So we're talking about a difference of a 20% gain in strength in creatine users, even like highly resistance trained creatine users, 20% increases in strength versus a 12% increase in strength in the control group. So this is across multiple studies. And so that is a significant advantage as a result of creatine use. And in creatine users, this is where the 2% value comes in. It's very typical for creatine users to gain 2% of their starting body weight. So after a loading phase. So whether you take 1 week to load using the loading dose protocol of 20 to 25 grams a day for about a week, or whether you just ride a maintenance dose out until you're fully loaded, which takes about 30 days. Once you're loaded, it's very common to gain 2% of your starting body weight as lean body mass. And so a 150-pound person would gain like 3 pounds, let's say, of body weight. And this would show up as lean mass. And it's visually apparent in almost everybody I've personally observed on creatine. You can kind of tell that what they looked like pre-creatine versus post-creatine. They just look more jacked, they look more full. And then you can take those strength gains and ride them out to eventual muscular size gains, regardless of your training status. So even though we investigated this question of how does creatine affect specifically, the muscle component of lean mass, and we saw these tiny, tiny changes. The caveats are untrained subjects and untrained subjects. So that's like the big caveat, really. I
Point
mean,
one,
that's a
untrained
huge.
subjects. Point two, C point one.
That's right. Yeah, basically yes.
And what about non-responders? Can there be, do we have non-respond people who just don't respond to creatine supplementation? Is that possible?
Yeah, yeah. You're more on top of this, my meta-analysis, than I am actually. That was one of the other major limitations, is that this is research by Greenhalf and colleagues back in the mid 90s, where they actually assessed who responds to creatine and who doesn't, and it basically comes down to this. It's like 20 to 30%, so a full, like almost like right about a quarter of the population responds very poorly to creatine, like they barely respond to it. So creatine non-responders, I mean, there's a formal definition of it, where to like less than, um, I believe it's 10 millimoles per liter of fat-free. I'm sorry, 10 millimoles per kilogram of fat-free mass. Less than that kind of gain in muscle creatine constitutes what would what we can call a non-responder. And so about 20 to 30% of people who take creatine are non-responders. But we can still say, that, hey, 70 to 80% of people who use creatine will get great results. Okay. But these poor 20 to 30% who don't respond, there's a couple possible reasons there. Number one, they could have a high initial level of muscle creatine.
Of saturation,
So
yeah.
yeah, so if you take somebody, we can use let's say Sean Baker, for example, who eats 4 pounds of meat a day. He's probably not going to get much of a response from adding an extra 5 grams of creatine a day to his diet, because he's probably getting like 8 to 10 grams a day of creatine from the meat in his diet alone. And there seems to be kind of a plateauing effect with creatine dosing that's right around 5-ish, possibly 8-ish grams in larger individuals per day, that you get the maximal size and strength gain effects out of creatine. And so if your diet is already pretty dang high in creatine, then additional supplemental creatine is not going to do a whole lot. And then there's differences in fiber type distribution across individuals that might affect people's response to creatine. But the fact of the matter is, our meta-analysis and most of the studies in these most creatine studies, and certainly the ones that we included, they don't assess for response versus non-response in the participants of the studies. And so that is kind of a question mark as well. And that's one of the caveats too. So the bottom line is, I still would recommend creatine, because you're still going to gain lean mass, you're still going to gain strength. And it's just that we oddly found a disappointingly small amount of muscle thickness gains and muscle cross-sectional area gains using these methods that are supposedly more precise than just measuring gross or net changes in lean body mass.
Let's talk about some of the other benefits that creatine has. So, as a trained chiropractor, one of the things that is very exciting to me is the effects that it has on the bones, joints, certainly glycemic control. When we talk about metabolic flexibility and fuel use, can you talk a little bit about some of the benefits of using creatine? And the other question I'll sort of tack onto this is, you mentioned 20 to 25 grams, let's say, for a week. So you're saturating the muscle at about, that's somewhere around 140 to if I could do math, 150 grams of creatine, or 5 grams. You said maintenance dose over the course of a month, so 5 grams a day. Do we cycle that? Do we go on and off of it? Is it a continuous, like, what are best practices for creatine use as well?
Sure, sure. Okay, so the first part of the question is that creatine is a multifaceted beneficial supplement. And we're talking everything from the level of the brain to the musculoskeletal level to the metabolic level. And so creatine in neurological health, that's an active area of study right now. And it does actually seem to help with things like cognition, especially in people with who are not who don't have optimal nutrition, um, who are running on like a low to no creatine intake, and who are also potentially compromised cognition wise, is showing a lot of promise for helping that. Um, Creatine also has been shown to help with joint health, joint function, non-muscle lean tissue function. Creatine also has been shown to increase bone density, and this is through direct as well as indirect means. So just helping the body perform better and from a lifting capacity is going to have indirect transfer to bone health. And creatine has also been shown even to help with pregnant moms or like in healthy pregnancy. I mean, there's a lot of metabolic demands that are increased as a result of the baby. And it's been at least hypothesized that creatine could help in that whole anabolic process of the growth of the child. And so creatine just happens to be one of those, you can almost call it conditionally essential compounds that we can either get from the diet or we can supplement with it. But I think that, I don't know, that might be putting it a little bit too liberally, because there's a lot of people who live ripe, long, healthy lives without supplementing creatine in the diet and without getting a whole lot of it in their diets. But it's one of those things that you could choose to optimize health with.
As you were talking about pregnancy, one of the things that I know to be true about creatine is it does help with glycemic control. So I wonder, and I don't know if there's probably no studies in this because you could never get an IRB for it, but I wonder with individuals who are more susceptible to GD, where we have, let's say, gestational diabetes.
Mhm.
I wonder if creatine supplementation would help in any way, either maybe not prevent, but at least help to manage someone who is dealing with gestational diabetes as well. I don't know if you are familiar with, or if you know of any studies that have ever looked at that. I don't know if you can study pregnant
Mhm.
women in any capacity,
Yeah,
supplement versus
yeah.
not supplement, but yeah.
You can make the hypothesis, I mean, yes, true. I mean, it would be tough to get the, ethics approval for that kind of study. But creatine does, it increases insulin independent muscle glucose uptake, and it increases insulin sensitivity. And so therefore it has been speculated that creatine would be an effective supplement for the management of diabetes, um, adult onset diabetes specifically. And so why wouldn't it help with gestational diabetes? Because we're talking about similar mechanisms at work, similar pathologies at work here. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I would be pretty optimistic about that application of it.
Let's since we're talking about an ultra processed food, let's let's move to ultra processed foods for a
All
moment.
right.
That's my little nerd joke, because I actually, in all honesty and transparency. I don't actually know where I stand on ultra processed foods. I think that too much of them probably bad, probably upregulating or dysregulating. We'll say appetite regulation centers.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically, where I want to lead this conversation is seed oils, and I hear a lot. Currently, there's a lot of, we'll say, noise about seed oils. It does seem to be spoken about as this like single monolithic species. It's like just seed oils. It's just one thing. It's just this one thing. And I don't know where I stand on it, because there's a lot of people that I know and respect that talk about seed oils as if it is the thing that if you get cancer, it's because you had seed oils. Um, and then I was saying to you sort of before we officially got going, like I don't see that in human data in the human study. So I don't actually know what to think about it. It's probably too much of it is probably bad. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Help me understand why
Mm-hmm.
people are why is the signal, let's say, around seed oils so loud, particularly right now?
Okay, so people get emotional about the seed oils thing, and it's because people associate seed oils with these big scary threats like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes and all that stuff. But I think that what you mentioned, that we can't just look at seed oils as this single unit that you can lump everything in there, just like you can't look at dairy as just this single monolithic unit that you can lump everything in there. It's like
Mm.
saying seed oils are bad is the equivalent of saying dairy is bad. What particular type of dairy are we talking about? They have different effects. Like there's quite a big difference between the effects of butter versus the effects of, let's say, yogurt, but they're
Right.
both dairy. And so just because in, diners across middle America, they're reusing and just using for frying over and over again, let's say corn oil and a mix of corn oil or soybean oil, let's say. That doesn't mean that you should avoid flax seeds, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, and any type of seed that you can think of, sunflower seeds. People start
Sesame seeds. I love
set
sesame seeds.
sesame seeds, sesame
Yeah.
oil,
Yeah.
um, canola. It's like, just because canola oil may be used in some restaurant establishments over and over to fry food, that doesn't mean that using canola oil for cooking at home is bad. And I would even take it a step further. It's like, okay, yes, using high heated seed oils for frying over and over again, of course that's going to be bad. But what are you comparing that to? What oils do you propose? That if you switch that canola oil out with, let's say, palm oil, or heck, butter or lard, you're still going to get as bad or worse health effects. So why are you singling out, why are you like cherry picking the seed oils for these bad effects? It doesn't make sense. And when you compare, because okay, like the proposed mechanism is the oxidation products of seed oils as a result of repeated frying and stuff. Well, what's going to happen there? Okay, well, it's been shown that like highly oxidized oils can do X, Y, and Z. Okay, so the focus here would be adverse changes in blood lipids that would kind of start people on this path towards atherogenesis and cardiovascular disease. Okay, cool. Now let's imagine we just use lard for this. Okay, less oxidation products, but you're still going to adversely affect blood lipids more directly as a result of, let's say, using butter and lard for cooking as opposed to canola oil for cooking. So you're getting to the same destination just through different pathways. And you can take it a step further. It's like, let's look at the literature. Let's look at the human data on vegetable oils versus butter and lard, the two, main animal fats that we're cooking with. Overwhelmingly and very consistently, the health outcomes are better for the vegetable oils compared to the saturated fat based oils and fats used for cooking. And so you just have to take a step back and look at the evidence and ask yourself, okay, so what am I basing my beliefs on? And then a lot of times when people don't like the evidence, they will default to it's big vegetable oil funding the studies, follow the money, big canola, it's funding the studies. Okay, well, do you really think there's no big butter, big dairy, big lard? Of course there is. You know, do you really don't think the beef industry and the egg industry is funding all the major studies for that? Of course they are. So somebody's got to fund the research. So we can't just cop out and say, look at who's funding it. Because if you just say, look who's funding it, are you willing to throw out all of the positive olive oil research because big olive oil funded it? Well, you better be if you want to be internally consistent with your line of logic. And so the evidence is what it is. I personally, I like the taste of olive oil much better than most oils, than canola oil. I like it better than canola oil. I like it better than corn oil or any of the other oils. I mean, there's a meta-analysis that was recently put out comparing canola oil and olive oil on changes in blood lipids. And canola oil actually outperformed olive oil for, LDL lowering and just changes
Oh,
in the blood
wow.
lipid profile. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It outperformed olive oil. But you know what? I'm not going to switch to canola oil for that because it's probably not going to make any meaningful difference in a lifetime or two, whether I'm using canola oil or olive oil, because I'm just not drowning my foods in oils anyway. Um, Actually, I do love olive oil, and I do kind of drown my foods in olive oil sometimes. But yeah, it's about the evidence, Stephanie, and it's about people just dropping their egos, and it's about people considering whether or not they're listening to internet fairy tales or whether they're just taking a hard, honest look at the evidence and not copping out to, who's funding the study, you know, because that's a self-defeating bias, is just writing off research because of who funded it. You're going to have to write off all the nutritional studies that you hang your hat on if you wanted to take that route.
The other thing I've heard you talk about, which I appreciate, is this, we'll call it logical fallacy, this sort of appeal to nature. Well, our foremothers and forefathers never had the capacity to consume canola oil or corn oil or soybean oil. So if something is altered from its natural state, then it must be bad for you. And that's sort of how I led into this conversation with creatine, because it's, I mean, you find creatine naturally in animal products, but as a supplement, like, how do you think it got into that tub, in Whole Foods or wherever it's an artificial product. So I wanted to, bring that up and sort of pair these topics together because cancer is also a natural. It's also a natural process. It's also organic. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you, right? So there's this, we'll call it fallacy in thinking that you're describing, and then I've seen you also talk about this appeal to nature. I think is how you describe it,
Yeah.
which I like. If it's organic, then it must be better for you. And it's like, well, ammonium, is organic. It's not, that's not good for you either, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. I mean, there is some wisdom and there is some benefits to going natural when you can, but I think that it can be treacherous to deny certain aspects of technology that enhance human quality of life.
Yeah.
And I think it translates to multiple domains, whether it be medicine or whether it be nutrition and food technology, whether it be like, travel technology. um, and it just transfers to multiple domains, and it can be a double-edged sword. Food technology can be a double-edged sword. I think that with with certain types of foods or certain food groups, there are only it's kind of a minority of applications where the more processed it is, the better type of thing. Like for example, um, you talk about food refining and ultra processing and stuff like that. Generally speaking, with fat and carbohydrates, processing and refinement is not necessarily the best thing. Um, but of course, there's going to be exceptions. Like with carbohydrate, an ultra endurance athlete is not necessarily going to be, chomping on a like a sweet potato or an apple during their race type thing. We've got food technology for that. We've got drinkable, highly easily digestible carbohydrates for that sort of thing. But generally speaking, ultra processing of foods is not great, especially when you're looking at carbohydrate. Now, there's always nuance to keep in mind because the exception of ultra processing would be protein and protein powders. I mean, those guys are highly engineered wonders of food technology, but they're kind of a cheat code for achieving health and longevity and performance. So hey, it's kind of an interesting thing. People rip on ultra processed foods, but there happens to be an array of foods in the protein department that accomplish really positive things health wise, and and it kind of reminds me of the topic of artificially sweetened stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a difference between somebody who will drink a dozen cans of diet soda a day. In their case, hey, they're probably not doing the best that they possibly can for their health because of a number of reasons, possibly including maybe the amount of artificial sweetener they're taking in, or maybe the amount of caffeine they're taking in with each one of those cans of diet soda. But you look at the other person who has a protein shake or two a day. All right, well, their protein powder is artificially sweetened, but number one, it's highly debatable whether that artificial sweetener is doing anything negative at all, especially in that dose. And number two, it's enabling this person to optimize their protein intake, to have that perhaps that protein shake or meal or whatever it is to double as a dessert instead of an actual dessert that they would get. And the convergence of those benefits would result in favorable changes in health and body composition and the maintenance of that. So yeah, I mean, it can be, there's different things to talk about with this topic.
I think I share your view in that we want to try and minimize, let's say, you don't want to be, throwing back jugs and jugs of canola oil, or, at the end of the day, you don't want to use any of the oil. Maybe let's say these midtown diners that you mentioned have been
Mm-hmm.
using all day long. Um, and the same is true as you mentioned with, the Diet Cokes. If you're having a case of Cokes, let's say a day versus like the protein powder, I think that there's different outcomes there. Um, where do you fall on? And I get this question, and to be honest, I feel like it's a bit out of, I can study it, but it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Where do you fall on the non-nutritive sweeteners like the aspartames? And I know there's different categories of them. So we have like the
Mm-hmm.
sucralose, the saccharins, and then we have this sort of newer category, or maybe just newer to me, this, allulose as more of a sweetener. Where do you fall in terms of looking at non-nutritive sweeteners, choices for yourself, and what does the data indicate in terms of human safety, and what is, when we're thinking about in the context of, holism, let's say, like the net effect on the individual? Is it net positive, net neutral, net negative?
Artificial sweeteners are so, I mean, the doses necessary to achieve what they achieve are so minuscule. I mean, it's almost like it's more dangerous taking a walk in the LA air than drinking a diet soda. Um, it's just, I mean, the danger of it is just way overblown. And you bring up a good point that artificial sweeteners are diverse in their biological effects. So something like, for example, stevia, the steviol glycosides, that kind of family. There's an array of potential therapeutic effects of stevia, and it's fascinating. I looked at this stuff and it's like, dude, this is almost like a medicinal type of sweetener. And so on the other hand, you have something like saccharin, which has been shown to cause unfavorable changes in gut microbiome, and they're linking these changes to a reduction in glucose control when they fed high doses to rats and also high doses to humans in a week-long study by Suez and colleagues a few years back. And so that kind of raised a bit of concern about saccharin, because this hasn't been seen in other artificial sweeteners. But then the question becomes, okay, so how relevant is the potential harm of high dose saccharin? Where are you going to get saccharin from other than the pink packets at your local diner? And the answer is you're really going to have a tough time finding products sweetened with saccharin, and you're going to have a hard time overdosing on these products unless you just really take down 7 packets of the 7 pink packets into your coffee or something.
But they're also like 100 times, I can't remember the number, but it's like 60, 70 times sweeter than sugar. Like it would be
Yeah.
impossible to take 7
Well,
packets
that
of
that was the
sweet and low.
dose.
Yeah.
That was the equivalent dose that they gave the rodents and the humans in Suez et al. I think it was 20. I forget. It was in the mid 2010s that they did this study. But a few years after that, more recently, they compared saccharin, sucralose, aspartame, and possibly ACK or some ACK. They compared 4 sweet, no, oh, and actual sugar. I believe that was the fourth comparator. And they compared the effects on body weight. And saccharin actually did not help with prevent increases in body weight. And so saccharin was the poorest performer of the artificial sweeteners in terms of changes in body composition, as well as that earlier study where it showed that it potentially screwed up glycemic control at high doses. And so we see a repetition of concern surrounding saccharin. So we can say, at least tentatively, that of the artificial sweeteners, saccharin could maybe be the one that you want to avoid or minimize. But the the food industry listens to the audience, and so saccharin has been phased out, mostly out of commercial existence, except for those little pink packets. Aspartame, there's been an uproar about aspartame because it's got enough bad press in the lay media that people stopped buying aspartame containing products. So the food industry responded, okay, it's kind of hard to find aspartame now. And so what we're left now with, we're left with sucralose, stevia, ACE K.
What the sugar
Now we got
alcohols, like the
the
erythritols
sugar
and
alcohols,
the xylitols and
right?
stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, erythritols and the sugar alcohols, and we got monk fruit in there as
Mm.
well.
Yeah.
Monk fruit extract, yeah. And so all of those are fair game. I mean, they all have good safety profiles. Erythritol has gotten some bad press recently from just kind of a frustrating study that showed essentially that people with cardiovascular diseases and major cardiac events happen to have high blood erythritol levels. But the study was really kind of useless because it did not assess erythritol intake. It just drew an association between blood erythritol levels and major cardiac events. And that it's impossible to draw any kind of meaningful and certainly no definitive conclusions from a study like that that does not assess erythritol intake. I mean, there's erythritol present in an array of fruits and vegetables and stuff, and so the erythritol scare is unwarranted. The artificial sweetener scare that the World Health Organization just put out, I mean, that's unwarranted as well. And this is because, like, there has to be some biologically plausible mechanism for you to worry about that could lead to disease. So the artificial sweeteners have to affect some biological process that is a realistic causal link in the chain towards disease. And so when you look at large populations who have diabetes or heart disease, those populations have body weight related pathologies. And so we're talking about diabesity, as it were, obesity and diabetes combined. And these populations will have a tendency to seek out diet products to a greater degree than non-disease populations, than healthy populations who are of normal body weight. And so the phenomenon of, in quotes, reverse causation is very real and can confound the results of these studies that look at populations who happen to be overweight and or have diabetes and or heart disease, but who are also consuming products with artificial sweeteners at a higher rate, higher amount than other populations. And it's highly unlikely that the artificial sweeteners are causing heart disease and diabetes. It's much more likely that the opposite is true, is that the state of having diabetes and or heart disease and or obesity drives the seeking of artificial sweetener intake. But we can't determine this with observational research. So what we have to rely on are randomized controlled trials that can investigate the cause and effect relationships physiologically between artificial sweetener intake and clinical effects. And what we find consistently is that steps in the causal chain towards diabetes and heart disease are essentially short-circuited by artificial sweetener use, especially when it's used in place of regular old sugar. So artificial sweetener use lowers total energy intake, it lowers body weight, it lowers body fat. And the criticism there is that, okay, well, these trials are just short trials. Okay, these randomized control trials. This is short-term data. And what about these observational studies looking at people for like 10 years, like, 20 years? We're looking at these disease endpoints with this observational data. And how can you rely on randomized controlled trials that just last a few weeks or a few months? And the answer to that is we need to look at both. We need to look at epidemiology and we need to look at controlled interventions. And if there is a convergence of results from both of those lines of evidence, then we can confidently say, aha, well, artificial sweeteners are causing disease processes at the intermediate level in randomized controlled trials, and they're resulting observationally in actual disease endpoints in observational studies and epidemiology. So we have a convergence of evidence from these two types of research. But we don't have that. We have a total split. And so, unfortunately, epidemiology is poorly controlled. You can run an epidemiological study for 10 years, but what they do is every few years, they have the subjects fill out a questionnaire and send it. And it's like, okay, cool.
We
We
got
have
to
a
do
20-year
better in
study.
nutritional science. Come on. Like, we got to do
It's
better.
like,
I can't, if you asked me what I ate last week, I couldn't tell you what I mean, I could give you some rough estimate, but there's no way that it's accurate. Yeah.
but that's the problem, Stephanie. It's like, the evidence against artificial sweeteners is so weak. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, the randomized control trial evidence involves short periods of time and involves low numbers of subjects, but at least we're able to control the experiment and see what happens physiologically, and it just doesn't add up to you know cause for concern,
Yeah. And obesity,
except
I
for
think,
maybe saccharin.
yeah. Except for saccharin. Yeah. And I would say as a comment generally, when we're talking about diet, diabetes, obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, these are very complex pathophysiologies. So to reduce it to, well, it must be, erythritol intake or, whatever, I think is, uh, you know, short-sighted at best and, stupid at worst.
I am a proponent of people getting, or at least trying to get into the habit of drinking plain water, and or sparkling water and or tea and things that don't contain artificial sweeteners. So um, I am a proponent of that. I would rather see people drinking plain water than getting hydrated from Diet Coke. I would
Same.
much rather I
Yeah.
would much
That's
rather
a
that.
reasonable position to take. Yeah.
But I am not of the position that if you take somebody who is used to drinking, let's say, 3 cans of Coke a day, and you bring them down to 1 to 2 diet versions of that a day, and then they're consuming 500 calories less per day from the added sugar. I think that's a good trade, and I think you
Mhm.
kind of meet people where they're at, and then you take it from there. um Obviously, there's this pie in the sky utopian level of health that you can strive for. You can certainly, if you want to, avoid all artificial sweeteners, just to even avoid the hypothetical concerns. Hey man, more power to you, but I wouldn't universalize that recommendation, especially to the degree that people are getting scared that their protein powder is sweetened with something. You know, I think that's when you start turning the corner to diminishing returns, when you could
Yeah.
be getting quite a bit of benefit.
Hmm.
Okay, so I wanted to get that out of the way, and yeah, thank you so much for having me on again. And I think that there's still more to talk about, Stephanie. So, and for the listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. You can find my work at alanaragon.com. I do have a monthly research review. That's my baby that I've been doing since 2008. And I think it's my best work, and I'm super proud of it. I have a book that I put out almost a year ago. It's called Flexible Dieting, but the title is misleading because it's just mainly, evidence-based nutrition for people who are into that kind of thing. I just got invited to be the keynote speaker for the Obesity Medicine Association in their fall conference this year. So in October. So
Congratulations.
that's gonna thank you. That's gonna be interesting. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And like I said, there's probably going to be a part 3. I didn't get to, again, I'm looking at my notes. We didn't get to weight loss plateaus, perimenopause, menopause, deload
Oh,
weeks, all the stuff, but we'll save it for another time, because every time I talk to you, the conversation just gets richer and richer. So thank you again for your time. And we'll talk to you soon.
oh, the plateau one is so good. Okay, next time. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Dr. Stephanie.
All right. We'll talk soon.